They started calling her Mrs. Rourke while I was still alive inside my marriage. Which is a strange way to discover your name can be peeled off you like a label and pressed onto someone else's shirt, the first time I heard it. At Cooper's over by the pits where the smoke has a sweetness you taste for hours. A young man from the high school tennis team said, "Hey, Mrs. Rourke, the brisket's ready," and the woman who turned at the sound of my name wasn't me but the housekeeper I had hired 3 months earlier for Tuesdays and Fridays. Maribel Cantu, with her springy black ponytail and the wrists so thin the chalk line of a hair tie left a dent. She smiled, waved, and the counterman didn't correct himself. And Calder, my husband, owner of Rourke Hardware and Feed on Main, whose favorite stories begin with, "Back when this river still froze," tipped his cap at the slip without meeting my eyes, like the name was a paper cup in a stream he didn't want to wade toward, so I said nothing either and chewed meat that went dry in my mouth and listened to the clatter of trays as if pots were crashing in a kitchen only I could see. We weren't a family that hired help until the spring lilies went moldy in a vase I forgot for 9 days and the smell outdreamed the house. The bookkeeping clients doubled after Hill Country Roofing decided to outsource their payroll to someone who'd show up with coffee and a laptop that didn't run updates during tax season. And the dust, the laundry, the stacked plates that always look like unfinished chores began to form a second marriage in this house. Me and the house joined in an exhaustion ceremony no one attended. I called 3 numbers off a faded flyer at HEB and 2 never returned my message. But Maribel texted back in clear sentences, asked whether we had a dog, whether bleach was okay, whether we preferred her to fold towels into thirds or halves. And this flared into a relief I didn't know I could feel about folding towels. Which is how she started coming on Tuesdays and Fridays with a small music speaker and a canvas bag of her own cleaning supplies, like a chef who'd learned not to trust other kitchens. The first Tuesday she discovered the way our house held on to smells. Wood polish lingering like a shy guest, Calder's aftershave curling down the hallway, the ghost of oil from the fry pan that never left bottoms of drawers. She opened windows to the Llano morning river air and cedar and that faint mineral cold that lives in limestone. Then hummed while she worked, melodies that were not English or Spanish but something in the space you hum when your hands move and your brain is turning off the real world. A stack of mail went missing that day and turned up in the freezer under a bag of Hill Country peaches because I'd done one of my midnight tidying sprees and pinned the envelopes under frozen fruit as if to cool a debt would calm it, and she laughed when she found them. A surprised laugh that didn't feel like judgment, and said, "Senora Elowen, next time just text me, hide and seek, and I will find all your bills." And the way she said, "Elowen," the rare way she didn't shorten it or repeat it like a mistake, laid a warm coin on my tongue. Calder came home early that Friday. Boots loud on the floor, he usually tiptoed across when he knew I was balancing accounts. And he met her at the laundry nook with the huge bag of rags the hardware men use for stain and turpentine. There was a scuffed look to him, like the dull rub of iron against iron had made scratches only I could see. And I watched the 2 of them negotiate the rags, where to soak, whether vinegar or baking soda killed the smell, like I was watching a small play in my own house, a play about people who did not need me to translate domestic life to each other. He looked surprised when she told him vinegar first, then wash hot with a cup of baking soda, as if she had spoken a password to a door he'd never known existed, and he said, You sound like my Nana May, which was the greatest compliment he gave to any woman who could make a stain disappear. She grinned. And the grin had no intention inside it except the uncomplicated delight of being good at something useful, and for a heartbeat it softened the rooms. The first slip that should have told me something was wrong came in the shape of a key. We had a spare hidden out on the back porch under the ceramic armadillo I hated but never moved, because Calder's father placed it there in a superstition about luck. And one Friday Calder handed Maribel a new key on a brass sunflower ring that we hadn't discussed, then looked at me as if he'd remembered to pick up milk. As if this were a kindness that cost nothing but saved time. I nodded because logistics ran our days and this was logistics. And anyway, she'd already been inside the house twice a week and had seen my sadness shoes, the old canvas pair I wore when I knew the day would be heavier than an average Tuesday, and the tower of receipts in a mixing bowl and the blackout curtain one never fully closed, leaving a blade of light so thin it carved the room beautifully and also made me feel like a thief. Tuesdays became loud with the music she liked and Fridays smelled of lemon oil. And she stayed longer, adding extras I hadn't asked for. Hand-washing the crystal we never used, rehanging crooked frames, carrying a bucket to the porch to wipe pollen from the Adirondack chairs. If you have guests this weekend, you are ready, she said once. And I didn't tell her we hadn't had guests since the Christmas after my mother died, when everyone came to admire the way grief had made me meticulous. As if straightening the ornaments on a tree could steady a house that creaked. People in town notice who goes in and out of your doors even when they pretend they don't. And that's how a name begins to move on its own, a woman at the pharmacy said to me. Your niece is a marvel with windowsills, and when I said, I don't have a niece, she laughed like I was being dry and said, well, the one with the ponytail who picks up your thyroid pills. She told me she's Mrs. Rourke, and I believed her because she said it like someone who has dinner waiting at 6. And there was a hitch in my throat that told on me in front of a shelf of cough drops. Later Maribel apologized for the medicine pickup. He asked me to grab it, he forgot. I said your last name because the clerk kept asking who I was, and then she said, Mrs. Rourke, like it was a test, and my mouth said yes before I could think, and I'm sorry. I should have said housekeeper, not wife, and she folded the pharmacy bag into a perfect square and tucked it into the pantry with the lunch sacks as if the neatness could undo the noun that had marched out of her mouth. Calder thought it was funny. He liked small-town misunderstandings the way some people like riddles. And at dinner he retold the story with a sheriff's office twang until even the fork in my hand felt like it was part of the comedy. He kissed my temple when he passed behind my chair and said, You know who you are, Elle. And I smiled because denial can be as tidy as a folded bag, but inside, where the ledger in me keeps lines straight, a red number began to wink. On her 5th Friday she stayed past 6 to iron shirts in my office, the door propped open. And she asked innocent questions while the hiss of steam covered our answers. How did we meet? At a high school car wash fundraiser where he was raising money for the FFA. And I was there with my friend Kinna, who later moved to New Mexico and got a job counting blue cranes for a conservation group. Do I like my name? Yes. Because it sounds like a winding road and because my mother chose it after a girl in a library novel whose shoes were always muddy. Did we want children? We tried, then stopped. Then told ourselves the river was enough. She told me her brother worked nights in Mason. Her mother lived in a small RV by the pecan orchard and filled it with crocheted blankets. She collected the tiny hotel soaps people left behind when they checked out of the roadside motel where she once did laundry. Sometimes she laughed in that surprised way even when nothing was funny, which should have made me ask what brightness or fear was zipping under her skin. But it was easier to let someone else's joy tidy the corners of a room I hadn't cleaned in my chest. The second slip came on a Sunday in June when our church secretary called the house to ask if Mrs. Rourke could bring 2 extra pies to the homecoming lunch and left the message on the machine, and Calder replayed it 3 times, eyes soft with amusement, and then called the office to say, with a little theater in his voice, that the real Mrs. Rourke would bring kolaches and a Texas sheet cake, but no one should expect pies. He hung up and said to me, "Could be worse, L. Could be people calling her sheriff," and that made me laugh, a sound too high. And we kissed like grown-ups who remember their bodies even if they've lost the habit of reaching for them on ordinary mornings. If this were something simple, if all he wanted was someone younger to admire him, or someone not me to notice the way he stacked lumber until the edges made a clean plane, I would have smelled it, because the body knows when hunger shifts rooms. But there was nothing to smell except lemon oil and starch. And there was nothing to see except kindness. And that is how unfaithfulness begins in houses like ours. Not with a slammed door, but with all the right ones left open. There was a Tuesday when she arrived without her sunflower key and knocked softly. The rap-a pattern I recognized a week later in the way she tapped the brake of her car at the stop sign outside our driveway, as if she were telling the air a secret and it agreed to keep it. She was pale under her summer tan and said her mother had been dizzy all morning and could she take the late shift instead, and I said yes, because who denies dizziness? And when she came back at 5, the house had that rare golden hour where everything catches honey and pretends to be more valuable than it is. She moved through rooms like someone looking for parts of herself she'd left under couch cushions, and I pretended not to notice the hoodie folded at the foot of our bed. The one with the hardware store logo, because it was June and she had no reason to be cold. And yet I couldn't make a rule that said a woman couldn't wear a borrowed hoodie while wiping baseboards, which is how I met the version of myself who chooses explanations of ordinary over the itch of the weird. Town talk reached me sideways. A customer told Calder she'd seen his wife at the car wash buying sodas for the detail crew. A teacher said, "Your lady was sweet to my mama at the doctor's office." The pharmacy clerk began labeling our bags, Rourke, Cantu, like a hyphen itself had walked into the building, and every time I corrected someone, their faces did something I couldn't stand. Embarrassment melted into skepticism. As if my correction were rudeness and not a hand held out to my own identity, and so I started letting it stand, because correcting people began to feel like wiping down the same counter again and again and seeing the same smear appear, and I am an efficient woman if nothing else. The third slip wasn't a slip but a document, a thin envelope addressed to Mrs. Calder Rourke in polite type from an insurance agent out in Fredericksburg. And inside it a discount card for roadside assistance with a sticky note in ballpoint. "Welcome, Mrs. Rourke. Calder said you'd be handling auto. Let us know if that trip to Galveston is still on, Lydia." And there was the hush of insects you hear before a storm. I walked that envelope to the hardware store with my breath small. The kind of breath you take when you're not sure whether you're stepping into a nest. And I placed it on the counter and said, "You gave someone my name, Cal." And he looked from the envelope to me and then over my shoulder toward the back door where I Knew, because I am not stupid, that someone had left with the spring bell still echoing. And he said the thing that almost restored the air. I told her to put it in your name because that makes the rate lower, I swear. I swear on the red truck's bad alternator and on Nana May's casserole dish. Which are the two holy things I have, and ridiculous as it is, I almost believed that. Because money is a language men speak when they don't want to say want. And because we were the kind of couple who kept old receipts in a mixing bowl like archaeologists of our own frugality. It should have ended there with a stern talk and boundaries written like the list I keep on the refrigerator. Trash Monday, sweep porch Thursday, call Aunt Bertie Friday. But life doesn't obey refrigerator lists. A week later, while counting invoices, I opened the town Facebook page to look for the post about the farmers' market hours, and there, in the event photos, was Maribel at the Mason County Courthouse, grinning with a paper in her hand, tagged by a cousin. Congrats to Mrs. Rourke on the name change, can't wait to see you sign it at the DMV. And I made a sound I didn't know my body could make. A short bark like a fox caught in fence wire. It was a legal petition, the caption said, to change her last name from Cantu to Rourke for the purpose of professional and domestic consistency, and the clerk who processed it, a woman with a braid like a climbing rope who also happens to be our neighbor's niece, had left a comment with 2 red hearts and a gavel emoji. My fingers went so cold the keys on the laptop felt like pennies dropped in snow. I drove to the hardware store, past the river where teenagers were shouting bravely from the rocks, past the thrift shop where I once bought a lamp that makes evening read like a photograph from the 70s, and I didn't plan words on the way because planned words always desert me. I entered through the loading door because the front felt theatrical and the back felt honest, and I found him in aisle 4 with the screws and washers, aligning a pegboard because the nails never sit in a way that pleases him. He turned quickly. The way you turn when you hear your name shouted inside a silence, and I said, she's taken it on paper, Cal. Not by accident. Not because some clerk assumed. She chose it. My name is something she can file and stamp, and he said, slow down, and I said, no. Because slowness made this, and there was the sound of the bell up front and the squeak of a dolly and a boy asking for 2x4s. And we did that thing long marriages do where you pretend other people's needs make your conversation impossible, and in that pause he shouted toward the front, be right there. And then he lowered his voice and said, I told her it would make billing easier. And I laughed, a sound with glass edges, and said, tell me the truth you think will kill me so I can see whether it does, and he said nothing. Which is a kind of confession if you've been married long enough. That night I lay awake listening to the all-night hum of the refrigerator and the faraway rumble of a train, and thought about names. My maiden name, Pike, which sits small and sharp in the mouth, a fishhook of a word. The first time a teacher said, Elowen Pike, aloud, and I liked the way it sounded like a poem. You had to whisper, the day I wrote, Elowen Rourke, in the corner of a notebook just to see whether the New Balance would tip the letters off the line, and it didn't, it steadied them. The way, through the years, Mrs. Rourke has opened doors at clinics and lumberyards and gotten me a loan rate that didn't feel like robbery because the loan officer waltzed for the football team with Calder's aunt. And I realized my name was a passport I'd been stamping without inspecting the border. And someone had walked through my gate smiling. The next morning I drove to the courthouse with a thermos of coffee and a slip of paper that Said, 1 p.m., petition hearing, because the public notices are taped to a corkboard you can read if you arrive early and pretend you're looking for a charity bake sale. And I sat on a wooden bench under a ceiling fan that clicks like a loose metronome. And when the clerk called, Cantu, a woman with a ponytail rose, not alone. Calder stood up too from a seat I hadn't seen him choose. And the way he glanced around the room wasn't guilty or proud but tired. As if he'd lifted something he thought was light and found it full of stones. He saw me and a story moved through his face in 3 acts, surprise, hope that I would leave. And then acceptance, which is close to surrender, before the judge even entered. Before the little speech about the solemnity of names. I stood and stepped into the aisle where everyone could see me. And called out clear as a bell at dusk, Your Honor, I am Mrs. Rourke, not shrill, not a wail. Just a statement like, the river runs north here, or, we lock our doors at night. And Maribel turned, and what I read in her eyes wasn't triumph or apology but recognition. As if for the first time she'd realized my name is attached to a person and not to a door she kept opening. She was 26 and clever with vinegar and good with old people, and maybe she thought names could be a kind of community property. Like the way we share recipes and gossip and the music at the July 4th dance. But there in that room my name stood up on its small fishhook legs and made its claim. And something in Calder's shoulders dropped. Not relief and not grief but the awareness that a thing he'd convinced himself was administrative had a beating sound inside it. The judge came in, and I sat, and my hands were very still on my knees. And I decided that if the court stamped the petition I would make other stamps of my own, on checking accounts, on a deed, on a future that might use pike again the way you pull a forgotten jar of jam from the pantry and admire how it kept its color in the dark. But the judge looked at the page and asked, Is there a marriage? And the room went quiet the way fields go quiet when a hawk passes over, and in the quiet my husband said, No, sir, and my name, which had been trembling on the edge of a table, climbed back into my mouth and waited to see what I would do next.